I was grabbing a drink with a former colleague last Tuesday, a woman who spent her entire career in equity and organizational design.
Oh, that field.
Yeah. And she was practically vibrating with this sort of intellectual triumph, sliding a tablet across the table to show me headlines from the new 2026 Gender Stereotype Survey.
Let me guess, it proved something definitive.
It proved everything. She whispered, "It's over," with this, the zeal you only see in new converts. She said, "We've finally proven it, the way we see men and women. It's just a shadow cast by the office cubicle. Change the jobs, and you change the human soul."
Wow.
And she went on for 20 minutes about agentic mirrors and communal reflections, just one buzzword after another. To her, this wasn't research, it was liberation. She really believed that if you just shuffled enough names on boardroom doors, a few million years of evolution would, just evaporate.
The beautiful, seamless logic.
It was, until I asked her one question. I asked why gender-segregated career choices are actually increasing in the most egalitarian places on Earth, in Scandinavia.
Oh, yeah, I know what happened.
The shift was physical. That certainty just flickered and went cold. No counter-argument, no data. She just tightened her grip on her glass, looked away, and said, "That's just noise. It's a glitch in the transition."
A glitch?
Yeah. It was the same look someone gives you when you point out a structural crack in their temple. And that moment, that instant pivot from scientific celebration to this defensive, almost fearful dismissal, it stayed with me. It made me realize the survey isn't a breakthrough, it's a clinical symptom. We're watching the final successful capture of our academic institutions by a philosophy that sees biological reality as an inconvenience to be edited out.
And when you start calling the foundational facts of our species a glitch,
you're not doing science anymore, you're performing an autopsy on the truth. Okay, so let's unpack this. That whole exchange, and especially that instant dismissal of inconvenient data, it really points to a profound intellectual conflict happening right now.
it's a fundamental argument over what drives us.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to impartially look at both sides using the sources you've shared. First, we need to really dig into the data she dismissed.
The paradox.
The paradox where more gender equality seems to increase differences, not erase them. Then, and this is just as important, we have to understand the structural cracks she refused to see.
You mean why institutions are becoming so fragile when confronted with this kind of data?
Right. Why is there this dogmatic reaction to biological reality?
And what's fascinating here is that the sources you've got give us this really powerful, multi-layered critique. It moves way beyond just, simple data points.
So we're connecting the dots.
We're connecting the dots. We'll start with the empirical evidence from the Nordic countries, and then we'll dissect the institutional mechanics that generate this kind of ideological certainty, even when the findings are, well, questionable.
And ultimately, this all points to a systemic risk, doesn't it?
It does. A risk of what happens when any ideological project, left or right, starts overriding the objective search for truth in a society, especially when it comes to things like meritocracy and institutional competence.
Okay, let's start with that fundamental empirical challenge. The one that makes people like my colleagues so uncomfortable. The gender equality paradox, or GEP.
Right.
At its heart, it's a finding that just defies all the conventional wisdom about social progress. So how do we define it precisely?
The core definition of the GEP, and you'll sometimes hear it called the educational gender equality paradox, is the discovery that wealthy, highly gender equal countries, paradoxically, have a wider gender gap in STEM fields.
STEM being science, technology, engineering, math, computer science.
Exactly. It's a wider gap than you find in countries that are poorer or rank lower on all the normal indices of gender equality. It really suggests the path to parity might not be the straight line we all assume it is.
So the common assumption is the more equal the society, the more similar the outcomes between men and women become.
That's the standard social constructivist model, yes.
But the GEP suggests the opposite. The more equal and free the society, the more divergent the choices actually become.
That's the paradox.
What's the key evidence for this? Where is this data coming from?
A lot of it relies heavily on the work of researchers like Stowett and Geary, who used the 2015 PISA database.
And P.S. it is.
It's invaluable. It's a standardized assessment of 15-year-old students across nearly 80 countries. So it gives us this incredible baseline for actual academic aptitude.
And what did they find?
They found something extremely important. Globally, girls generally perform better in reading than boys. That's pretty well known. But critically, they perform similarly or in many cases even slightly better than boys in science and math across most countries.
Okay, so that's the key point. The cognitive ability, the aptitude for STEM, is not the limiting factor for girls?
Not at all. The capability is there, and it's equal, if not superior in some cases.
So if the capability is there, where does the divergence happen?
It happens in the transition. The moment you move from compulsory education to higher education and career choice, that's where the paths split.
And Stoa and Geary's work showed this.
They demonstrated it very clearly. The subsequent loss of females graduating in STEM fields, so the percentage of women choosing not to pursue STEM degrees compared to men, is significantly higher in the countries that score highest on gender equality.
Like Norway, Sweden, Finland.
Exactly. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland. That's the paradoxical part. The very countries that have poured the most resources, time, and political will into eliminating barriers for women in STEM are the ones that see the lowest proportional enrollment rates.
That sounds like a complete inversion of what every social policy for the last 50 years has been trying to achieve.
It is an inversion.
Can you give us a concrete example of this? Where do we actually see women choosing STEM most frequently?
The inversion is starkest when you look at the other end of the spectrum, the lower end of the Global Gender Gap Index. Take some Middle Eastern countries, for example, places that often score lowest on formal equality measures. Countries like Algeria, Jordan, or the United Arab Emirates.
And what's happening there?
Women in those nations tend to pursue STEM fields, especially engineering and computer science, in much, much greater numbers. Sometimes they even achieve parity or become the majority of enrollments in those fields.
Which is the exact opposite of what you see in Scandinavia or Western Europe.
The complete opposite.
That immediately challenges the whole narrative that social conditioning is the only thing driving these choices.
It has to.
Because if social conditioning were the primary factor, you'd expect the Middle East, with more traditional gender roles, to have the lowest rates of women in STEM.
And Scandinavia should have the highest. The data shows the reverse.
Right.
So the argument that flows from this data is, well, if these occupational differences between genders were purely the result of strong social conditioning, then those differences should logically vanish, or at least shrink, when you actively suppress that conditioning.
Which is the goal of egalitarian policy.
Precisely. You reduce the societal constraints. But the data shows that when the constraint is reduced, the divide actually gets larger.
So what does that suggest?
It suggests that non-cultural factors, things like genetics, biology, or, deeply seated psychological preferences, might be the primary drivers. They're asserting themselves when those external factors are minimized.
That makes a kind of economic sense. If you remove the societal push or pull factors, then individual preference is what's left to dictate the outcome.
That's the argument.
So let's dive into the competing academic models for why this happens in these affluent, equal countries.
Okay, so the explanations generally synthesize economic necessity with psychological freedom. They basically boil down to the fact that affluence changes the risk-reward calculation for your career choice.
Let's start with the financial necessity argument. How does necessity push women into these higher-paying, traditionally male fields?
It's a classic economic theory, just applied to gender. In countries with weak social safety nets, high unemployment, or just less egalitarian structures, a high-paid, economically secure STEM career is often seen as a critical pathway.
A pathway to what?
To securing your own and your family's economic well-being. The choice is driven by utility maximization, the raw need for stability and wealth. In that context, a woman might set aside other interests to pursue engineering because the marginal utility of that higher income is just critical.
So poverty or economic instability acts as a kind of great equalizer in career choice. It forces both men and women toward whatever the highest yield option is, regardless of what they prefer to do.
That is the key inference, yes. Now contrast that with a rich country with a strong welfare state.
Like Norway.
Like Norway. You know you're not going to starve. You have excellent health care. Your educational choices are heavily subsidized. The marginal utility of earning an extra, say, $50,000 a year by working in computer science versus working in child psychology, a field you might genuinely prefer, is much, much lower.
You can afford to choose based on interest.
You can afford to choose based purely on individual interest and preference, regardless of the economic leverage.
Which brings us to the next idea. The resource hypothesis. It sounds like this just formalizes that observation that affluence grants you freedom of preference.
It does. The resource hypothesis posits that societal affluence and development reduce those economic pressures, and in doing so, they open up opportunities for the full expression of gender-specific ambitions and desires.
When the constraints are gone, the differences emerge.
Exactly. When a society has abundant material and social resources, the old constraints that might have pushed women into high-demand fields just aren't there anymore. This allows for a greater and often a divergent expression of gender-differentiated preferences.
And the sources suggest this is especially true for personality traits.
Yes, things like women scoring higher on agreeableness on average and men scoring higher on systemizing. These differences manifest as different occupational interests when people are free to choose.
That seems logical. But there's a really fascinating counterpoint in the sources, the identity cost argument. It suggests that even in these free societies, new kinds of social pressure pop up.
Right.
How does this identity cost factor into the GEP?
The identity cost argument is critical because it introduces a sociological wrinkle to the economic model. It suggests that in these rich, gender-equal societies, the cultural norms around gender roles don't just vanish, they shift.
Shift how?
Specifically, the stereotyping of women as inherently communal or caring or focused on people, that has actually increased or become more prominent in these specific cultures.
And how does that create a barrier to STEM?
Well, pursuing a high-intensity, technical, mathematically focused career, what they call an agentic career, can incur a higher social penalty or identity cost for women in these countries.
So they feel a pressure to conform to the caring stereotype.
It could be subtle, but a persistent pressure. Or even just an internalized conflict for deviating from that highly valued communal norm. In Scandinavia, for instance, gender norms might still emphasize that women are the core caregivers, making professional choices that align with flexibility and social contribution more appealing.
Even if those choices mean a lower salary or lower status in a traditionally masculine field,
Right.
it's a trade-off.
This sounds very connected to that idea of being equal but different.
It's the practical manifestation of the equal but different gender norm. You see this often among affluent, well-educated couples who publicly support formal equality, but then in their private lives, they reinforce traditional gender roles in their choices.
Which leads to professional segregation.
Profound professional segregation. Women may choose the family and child-friendly jobs, the flexible ones in education, humanities, social care, while men take what are termed greedy jobs.
Greedy jobs, that's a pretty striking phrase. What does that mean here? It refers to those high-status professional roles. Think top-tier finance, complex engineering, corporate law that are incredibly rewarding financially, but demand an immense time commitment.
50 to 70 hours a week, the sources say.
50 to 70 hours and zero flexibility. And because those communal norms often still place the primary childcare responsibility on the mother, this lifestyle choice becomes gendered. The woman selects the career that allows for family alignment, and the man selects the greedy job that maximizes the family's income.
So the career paths diverge dramatically, not because of necessity, but because of lifestyle preferences that are only made possible by having enough resources in the first place.
Exactly.
Now, we have to be rigorous here. The GEP is a powerful empirical challenge, but it's not accepted as the final word. The sources offer some significant methodological critiques.
Oh, absolutely.
Where do critics argue that the GEP data fall short of proving, biological determinism?
The first, and probably the strongest critique, is about confounding variables. Critics argue that these gender differences are driven primarily by a country's overall level of human development, or HDI, not necessarily by egalitarianism alone.
And HDI is a broader measure.
It's a composite measure. It reflects not just policy, but a nation's wealth, health, education levels, and general safety.
So the argument is that Scandinavia is exceptional because it's highly developed, not necessarily because it's highly egalitarian.
Exactly. When researchers statistically control for HDI, meaning they isolate the effect of wealth and development, the independent effect of egalitarianism on these gender difference measures is often significantly lessened.
So it's the affluence that matters most.
The critique suggests that affluence and development provide the necessary conditions for these preference divergences to happen, regardless of whether that society is actively running a feminist project or not. It just so happens that the wealthiest nations are also the ones running the most egalitarian policies.
And if the GEP relies on comparing countries at different stages of development, that brings up a huge potential flaw, the causality problem.
That's the second major flaw they identify. The correlation between affluence, gender equality, and STEM gaps is based on cross-country or cross-sectional data. You're comparing, say, Jordan to Sweden at one single moment in time.
You can't infer causality from that.
You can't. To confidently claim that egalitarian policies cause the widening gap, you need robust longitudinal data tracking the same group of people over many, many years or controlled lab experiments. And critics are quick to note that kind of data is currently lacking for the GEP.
So it remains just a correlation.
Just a correlation.
There's also this question of whether the GEP is really reflecting deep-seated differences, or if maybe the stereotypes are just stronger in those rich countries.
That's the stereotype reflection versus cause debate. Research has shown that gender stereotypes, like math is not for girls, do appear to be stronger in highly developed, gender-equal countries.
Which is another paradox.
It is. The critical question is whether these stereotypes are the actual root cause pushing women away from STEM as social barrier, or if they're simply a reflection of the gendered preferences and choices that are already emerging in that high-liberty environment.
So are the stereotypes creating the behavior, or is the behavior creating the stereotypes?
Exactly. We don't know the direction of causality.
And finally, the sources bring up a factor that seems really overlooked. What if it's the men who are changing, not the women?
This is the men's divergence factor critique, and it's intriguing. When you analyze the raw data, it suggests that in developed countries, it's the men who are diverging from women in their choices, not the other way around.
How does that challenge the premise?
Well, it challenges the whole idea that women are retreating into the humanities because of some new societal pressure. Instead, it suggests that maybe men in Western countries are finding new ways to express their different interests.
That's a really interesting flip.
It is, especially when you contrast it with men in less developed countries, who, ironically, often have far more social power to set gender roles, but are still forced by necessity into those high-yield fields. It suggests that divergence might be driven more by changes in male occupational preferences in developed nations, not just female choices.
So the data is complex. It poses a serious challenge to the pure social constructivist view, but it doesn't offer undeniable proof for the essentialist view either.
It sits squarely in that messy, uncomfortable middle.
Which just fuels the philosophical conflict.
That's right, and the philosophical stakes here are enormous. The empirical challenge of the GEP immediately forces us to confront that core conflict over human identity. Nature versus nurture. Or, more accurately, where we draw the line between sex and gender.
Okay, let's define that boundary. What's the fundamental difference in how these two camps, the essentialists and the constructionists, view human behavior?
The core conflict really centers on the difference between sex, the biological, physiological, anatomical attributes, and gender, which is the psychological, social, and cultural processes.
And how do they relate?
Essentialism argues that these two are distinct, and that sex dictates, or at least heavily influences, gender. Constructionism argues that gender heavily influences our understanding of sex, or that the two are completely inseparable.
So what does the essentialist claim, often championed by figures who engage with this material, like Jordan Peterson, what do they argue in light of the GEP?
The essentialist view argues that gender differences are definitively not entirely socially constructed. They seize on the GEP data as empirical proof.
They're smoking gun.
Basically. If differences in personality and choice exaggerate themselves under conditions of total liberty and affluence, that strongly suggests there are underlying non-cultural factors asserting themselves. Therefore, they claim, the radical form of social constructionism has been empirically refuted.
The idea that it's all nurture.
The idea that all gender differences are purely a product of society, yes.
And what specific biological or evolutionary examples do they typically cite to support these differential preferences?
They often point to robust statistical differences in personality traits and physical attributes. For instance, the argument that men are, on average, physically stronger and therefore more drawn to high-risk, high-expenditure jobs like firefighting or heavy construction.
Jobs where extreme strength is a functional requirement.
Exactly. Evolutionarily, they might cite the argument that men are, on average, more expendable from a species perspective, which could explain a tendency toward riskier, more dangerous jobs. But most compellingly for the GEP, they cite psychological evidence showing that men tend toward working with things and systems, while women tend toward working with people and emotions.
And that preferential divide becomes starker in egalitarian societies where choice is maximized.
That's the core of their argument.
But the constructionist counterclaim often rejects the premise of an objective biological baseline in the first place. How do radical constructionists approach the concept of sex itself?
Well, radical constructionists drawing a lot from postmodern theory and figures like Judith Butler, argued that the very category of biological sex is culturally constructed and linguistically imposed.
So there's no objective reality there to measure.
They view gender and sex as these entwined processes with no clear, clean line between them. Butler's famous argument is that if you look closely at how sex is observed, measured, and categorized, it's already being filtered through a cultural lens, a system of categorization.
Meaning that sex was always already a function of gender.
Exactly. For them, there's no objective, pre-social criteria you can use to definitively separate the biological from the constructed.
That position seems to make the whole debate, including the GEP data, kind of irrelevant because they can just reject the fundamental categories being measured.
And that's one way they resist the empirical challenge.
Yeah.
It leads to the counterclaim that social constructionism as an epistemological perspective doesn't really lend itself to a single falsifiable scientific hypothesis.
It's not a testable theory in the same way.
Right. So claiming that it's been disproven by a single study is dismissed by its proponents as simplistic or as attacking a straw man version of the theory.
Let's focus on that straw man claim. Is it accurate to say that the essentialist critique only attacks a fringe view? I mean, do most academics really believe that differences are 100% nurture?
That is highly contentious. Many social scientists will argue that the critiques, especially from high-profile public intellectuals, are made against an extreme straw man version, the idea that it's exclusively social conditioning, and they'll say few serious academics actually hold that view.
But is that true?
It's complicated, because some voices within academia do hold extremely radical views, sometimes arguing that even physical differences beyond the obvious are heavily influenced by cultural expectations. The debate is often about where that line falls. Is it 90% nurture or 50% nurture? Not just a simple yes or no.
What about the evidence used to support the biological claim, like studies on young children? How does the essentialist side interpret that?
Proponents of a biological role often cite studies showing very early differences in preference, like for masculine versus feminine toys in 1 to 3-year-olds, long before they're fully immersed in language.
And they see that as evidence of an innate biological difference.
Exactly, an innate difference in object preference.
What's the constructionist critique of those findings?
Critics argue that those studies don't conclusively prove biology because children are so susceptible to early socialization. Parents buy sex-normative toys, kids observe behavior, they internalize it.
So a preference for a truck might just be a learned preference.
It could be driven by familiarity, exposure, or parental cues rather than a purely biological impulse. The environment starts shaping you from the moment you're born, making it almost impossible to separate nature and nurture in human subjects.
Which leads us to the non-human primate studies. They're an attempt to strip away that human cultural layer. What does that research show, and why is it also criticized?
Well, researchers have famously observed that juvenile male monkeys often prefer things like wheeled objects or balls, while female monkeys show a preference for plush objects or dolls.
And this is offered as evidence of biological programming showing up in our relatives.
Right, suggesting an innate differential object preference that predates human social culture.
On the surface, that sounds like pretty compelling biological evidence.
It is, until you apply the philosophical critique. Critics dismiss this whole line of argument as fundamentally silly or just deeply flawed.
Why?
Their point is simple. There are no inherently masculine or feminine toys to a monkey. The observed preference only shows that male monkeys prefer one set of shapes and females prefer another set of shapes.
So the leap to human culture is too big.
It's a massive leap of inference. To say that a monkey's preference for a plush shape is analogous to a human girl's preference for a culturally loaded doll that represents caregiving or communal roles, that's very difficult to justify.
So we have a philosophical impasse where both sides can explain the data. But let's go back to the role of economic structure. Constructionists argue that gender differences are products of the economy itself, which could explain the GEP without resorting to biology.
Exactly. Social constructionists point out that gender roles are dynamic. They shift based on economic necessity. The classic man as breadwinner dichotomy wasn't just a cultural choice, it was economically sensible when one industrial job could support a middle-class family.
An economic reality that's now mostly gone?
Right, with the need for dual incomes rising everywhere.
And how does that relate to the divergence we see in the GEP?
The argument is that long histories of capitalism create specialization and resource abundance that allows these differential preferences to emerge, or that actively constructs certain types of greedy jobs that disproportionately attract one sex.
So constructionism could even predict this divergence.
It could. It suggests that you would expect personality differences to diverge in the most developed economies, a divergence caused by economic and institutional evolution, not just biology.
This philosophical stalemate shows that no matter what the data says, a committed theorist can usually integrate the finding into their existing framework.
Which leads us to the bigger issue.
Right. If the data itself is inconclusive, what happens inside the institutions that are supposed to be finding the truth?
This is the pivotal moment. When data fails to settle a fundamental debate, it's the incentives within the institutions that determine which viewpoint achieves supremacy. Your opening anecdote perfectly illustrates this structural breakdown in academic objectivity.
The sources argue we've seen a systematic demise of traditional scientific norms.
A profound one.
What were these norms? I'm thinking of Robert Merton's work here. Why were they considered the cornerstone of objective truth-seeking?
Merton outlined 4 critical norms for science, all designed to guard against bias. There was communalism, open access to data universalism, judging knowledge, impersonally organized skepticism, always trying to falsify beliefs, and crucially, disinterestedness.
Let's focus on disinterestedness. What did that mean specifically?
Disinterestedness meant personal detachment from truth claims. A scientist was expected to be intellectually humble, to see their beliefs as just tentative hypotheses that could be changed by new evidence. The goal was to seek the truth, not to advocate for a particular outcome.
It was about freedom from personal, corporate, or political motivations.
That was the ideal.
And according to the sources, those classical Mertonian norms have been replaced. What is this new ethos that now drives a lot of academic science?
They argued the norms have been replaced by a system that prioritizes capitalism, particularism, and interestedness. Interestedness is now highly popular. Academics increasingly align their research with funding streams and policy agendas.
So science isn't just seeking impartial truth anymore.
It's often seeking relevance and policy support. This pushes scientists to act as issue advocates, using their academic titles to lend authority to positions that are way beyond their core expertise.
This sounds like the perfect environment for what the sources call politicization and policy-based science to flourish.
It is. Politics has increasingly started to see science as a managerial tool to handle hot potatoes, these complex issues that involve value judgments, like climate change, diversity mandates, or gender parity.
So instead of funding research just to understand the world,
politicians and bureaucrats measure science's utility by the policy support it provides. They're interested in policy-based, science-generating evidence to justify a policy they've already decided on, rather than neutral, science-based policy.
So instead of science guiding policy, policy is guiding science. And this demand for politically useful answers seems to necessitate the creation of a special kind of data, the science of the objectively unknowable.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates the problem. This new pseudoscience addresses potential hazards in ambiguous contexts where definitive data is impossible to get. Long-term, low-dose chemical effects, complex social causation, distant climate predictions.
Things with high uncertainty.
Exactly. Because this science is often imprecise, ambiguous, and non-falsifiable, it leaves ample leeway for subjective preferences or ideological goals to shape the findings.
So the researcher's personal beliefs get laundered through the veneer of scientific objectivity.
That's the danger. The sources warn that this environment risks science becoming nothing more than an extension or marketing arm for the body politic or the bureaucracy. Once you lose organized skepticism and disinterestedness, it's not a reliable source of fact anymore. It becomes a peddler of ideology.
To understand how this ideological laundering happens, we need to understand the mechanism of capture. The sources call it dominion capital. What is this, and who wields it?
Dominion capital is defined as this specific combination of skills, knowledge, often ideological or theoretical motivation, and networking that's used to coordinate institutional entry.
And the goal?
The goal is to shift organizations to serve the status and social leverage strategies of those who possess this capital. It's essentially the currency of institutional capture, and it's mobilized by modern activism.
This suggests that modern activism, as described in these sources, is less about achieving traditional political goals and more about gaining managerial power.
That is the core argument. Activism based on mastering abstract theory, the pursuit of some final, perfect form of society, tends to degrade institutions. It imports rigid ideological assumptions that override older, more objective patterns of operation.
The sources also make a provocative point about the personalities this attracts.
They do. They suggest this environment, which is focused on moral grandiosity rather than empirical outcomes, attracts manipulative personalities who are seeking power without responsibility. They can justify aggressive behaviors by appealing to the moral superiority of their cause.
So how does this Dominion capital consolidate its power? By creating what the sources call spurious expertise.
Spurious expertise is the intellectual currency generated by Dominion capital. It works by devaluing the choices, the lived experience, and the authority of the wider citizenry. By creating a hierarchy of special knowledge that only the in-group possesses. Its primary function is to justify perpetual intervention and the consumption of resources.
The sources offer a very strong specific example of this. The term sex assigned at birth. How is this characterized as an example of spurious expertise?
The sources characterize that phrase as scientifically unsound and used primarily for ideological signaling. They argue that for sexually reproducing organisms, sex is a foundational biological reality, not a subjective choice made by a doctor.
The term assigned suggests it's a social decision.
Exactly. It suggests it's an assignment rather than an observation. The sources define it as a grotesque lie that's generated out of queer theory, used primarily to signal that you adhere to the moral in-group. It establishes a boundary of who has the requisite Dominion capital.
And if you don't use that language, you immediately show you lack the expertise to even be in the conversation.
Right. And that expertise is also used to explain away policy failures.
Like the GEP.
Precisely. When your policies fail to produce the expected equality of outcomes, the spurious expertise has to kick in to explain the gap. It postulates endless, invisible sociological gremlins, unseen biases, lingering systemic forces, microaggressions, hidden structural inequalities. All these things are used to explain why equality of outcomes fails to materialize. And this endlessly complex, untestable explanation conveniently justifies continuing the programs and consuming more resources.
It sounds like a self-licking ice cream cone, where the inability to achieve the goal just requires more resources, which reinforces the bureaucracy.
It's a perfect feedback loop.
And what role do academic incentives play in accelerating this cycle?
The institutional incentive problem is central to all of this. The sources argue that academia's incentive structures don't ultimately reward genuine truth-seeking, they reward popularity.
Popularity with who?
Popularity among other academics who share the same ideology, or popularity among the funding bureaucrats who are looking for policy support. This creates a powerful, self-reinforcing echo chamber.
So conformity is rewarded more than dissent?
Absolutely. You have this combination of moral grandiosity, the belief that your project is universally good, risk-adverse conformity, the fear of dissenting from the consensus, and weak reality feedbacks not having to make anything work in the real world.
It's the perfect recipe.
It's excellent for generating spurious expertise, which then gets laundered and legitimized through mutually cited publications in academic journals. And that only further serves the status of those with Dominion capital. The feedback loop is sealed tight.
This institutional capture has profound consequences that go way beyond academic journals. When we shift the focus from objective analysis to achieving a specific moral outcome, what are the long-term systemic risks for society?
The risk escalates to the functional stability of our complex systems. When institutions start to prioritize the moral project of achieving equal outcomes, what we call equity over the core requirement of meritocratic competence, the whole infrastructure of society can become brittle.
We need to draw a sharp line here between historical activism and the current ideological focus. The sources distinguish between the emancipation sequence and the later fixation on equality of outcome.
That distinction is crucial. Historically, you have movements like abolition, women's suffrage, the early civil rights movement. They were about achieving inclusion and participation in existing social processes.
The goal was to enable people's choices.
Exactly. The core aim of this emancipation sequence was to dismantle legal and institutional barriers to create equal opportunity. It was a form of political bargaining.
And where was the pivot point?
The pivot happened when the legislation from the U.S. Civil Rights Movement created a legal and bureaucratic structure that gave administrators and agencies moral projects.
Which led to a fixation on achieving equal outcomes between groups.
Right. It moved from ensuring everyone can run the race to ensuring everyone finishes in a group-mandated order. That focus became the defining impulse behind what we now call social justice.
The pursuit of equal outcomes is inherently problematic for individual freedom, as Max Horkheimer observed.
Horkheimer. the founder of the Frankfurt School, he understood this dialectic decades ago. He stated it explicitly. The more freedom, the less justice, and the more justice, the less freedom.
Meaning, if you define justice as pure equality of outcome,
that pursuit must inevitably crush individual freedom, because it requires constantly overriding human choices and their natural consequences, like the preferences we see in the GEP. To make unequal outcomes equal, you have to coerce behavior.
And the people administering this coercion, the bureaucrats, the activists, they need a defense mechanism for when their projects fail. This is the activist's fallacy.
The activist's fallacy is the primary mechanism that undermines accountability in these moral projects. It functions like an unchallengeable moral shield.
How does it work?
If an activist is implementing policy X to achieve moral goal Y, any criticism of policy X, no matter how legitimate or based on its incompetence or wastefulness, is immediately reframed as an attack on moral goal Y itself.
The response is always, you are criticizing X, therefore you are against Y.
Exactly. You're against equality or justice or diversity.
Which means the system becomes inoculated against self-correction. What's the eventual cost of replacing functional criteria with ideological criteria?
The cost to competence is systemic. When selection based on merit on functional capacity is replaced with equity-based social engineering, the devaluation of competence gets baked into the organization. The sources warn that this risks a cascading collapse in complex systems that rely on high reliability performance.
Like infrastructure, hospitals, specialized emergency services.
All of it.
So the immediate goal of social engineering might be achieved, equal representation, but the long-term cost is functional decay.
That's it. The systems become cognitively entropied. If you look at high-stakes environments like technical fields or emergency services, and you appoint personnel based on criteria other than their proven ability to perform the core, dangerous function of the job, you degrade the entire organization's capacity.
The sources use the example of fire departments.
Right. Appointing personnel based on diversity metrics, potentially compromising the ability to save lives when carrying 70-plus pounds of gear, is a critical physical requirement of the job. It's a consequence of prioritizing representation over a functional requirement.
Now, a lot of these equity initiatives are justified because the system they're replacing, meritocracy, is argued to be a myth in the first place. What does the scholarship say about that?
The scholarship really challenges the common narrative. The myth of meritocracy argument holds that achieving upward mobility through your own merit is generally unattainable in mature capitalist societies because of deep structural inequalities.
So even though the idea is promoted by the elite,
wealth disparity and limited class mobility remain widespread, regardless of an individual's work ethic. The sources suggest that inequality is actually increased precisely because the myth has been so effectively promoted and used to justify the status quo.
This means factors outside of personal effort like inherited wealth or family connections matter far more than the official story admits.
Absolutely. The work of economists like Robert H. Frank emphasizes the enormous, often unrecognized role of chance or luck in individual success, especially among highly talented people.
So hard work and talent are necessary, but not sufficient.
They're prerequisites. But among a group of equally talented people, luck being in the right place at the right time, having the right connections, often determines who ultimately succeeds. This fact fundamentally challenges the purely merit-based view of success.
Let's look at the concrete data on social mobility, specifically comparing the U.S. to the countries we were talking about with the GEP.
The statistics are revealing. In the U.S., class mobility is among the lowest in the industrialized world. Data shows that about 50% of a father's income position is inherited by his son.
50%.
Now contrast that with the Nordic countries like Norway and Canada, where that figure is less than 20%. And it gets worse. Only about 8% of American kids raised in the bottom quintile of income manage to climb to the top quintile as adults. In Denmark, that figure is nearly double 15%.
So despite being the global champion of the meritocracy narrative, the U.S. is one of the least meritocratic countries in terms of actual economic mobility.
Exactly. Yet Americans are still heavily conditioned to believe in the myth. This is often attributed to motivational factors. The psychological desire to believe the system is fair may be driven by the hope that you'll eventually join the elite.
And this collision, the stalled mobility colliding with the pervasive rhetoric of individual achievement, is what's generating all this societal frustration.
That frustration is the source of significant political upheaval. The sociologist Michael Sandel calls this the tyranny of merit.
The tyranny of merit.
He argues that the stalled mobility and the rhetoric that comes with it fuel deep anger and frustration, contributing significantly to the rise of populism. Populism, in this view, is a revolt against this tyranny, the idea that success is purely earned and that those who fail have only themselves to blame. It creates a profound resentment of the credentialed elite.
Finally, let's return to the source of so much of this analysis, the academic disciplines themselves. The sources suggest that by focusing so heavily on this moral project of justice and inequality, sociology is actively marginalizing itself.
Yes, what they call the consequence of sociology's irrelevance.
What is that consequence?
It's tragic for the discipline. As sociology increasingly defines itself as this ideologically oriented enterprise, focusing almost exclusively on the moral project, it necessarily marginalizes its hard science or empirically objective contingent.
And the outcome?
The predictable outcome is that sociology loses all relevance outside of the academic sphere. It willingly abandons the vast, lucrative resource niche for applied social science knowledge for what's often called social engineering.
The knowledge needed to run governments, NGOs, corporations.
All of it. And by prioritizing ideology over utility for a broad range of potential clients, it cedes that market to other disciplines.
And which disciplines step in to fill that vacuum?
Economics and psychology. The irony is that these disciplines are often intellectually less equipped to handle the complex, messy, structural problems of social organization that sociology was born to address. Sociology might endure as an academic field, but it risks never achieving its enormous potential because it's chosen ideological purity over broad applied utility.
Okay, so if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, the data on the gender equality paradox, the widening gaps in the most free societies, it serves as this empirical crack in the foundation of pure social constructivism.
A huge crack. It suggests that human differences are robust, they're complex, and they're highly resilient to social engineering.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. The defensive reaction to this data, treating it as a glitch in the transition, is a clinical symptom.
A symptom of what?
Of institutions prioritizing a moral narrative, the pursuit of equal outcomes, over the actual complex and often inconvenient facts of human nature and variation.
The sources really compel you to understand that while the whole nature-nurture dichotomy is often too simplistic, when institutional incentives reward moral grandstanding and the generation of spurious expertise, those invisible sociological gremlins, the result is profound.
Science stops serving truth.
It stops serving objective truth and starts serving ideology. And that risks both institutional competence and ultimately the functional capacity of complex societies that rely on specialized meritocratic expertise.
So what does this all mean? The most profound observation I think we can draw from these sources is about the price of certainty. The data suggests that when systems are most free, individual differences, including those potentially based on biology, assert themselves powerfully.
And the attempt to coerce those outcomes back toward uniformity.
As seen in the policies driven by dominion capital and spurious expertise, it isn't just bad science. It's a process that necessitates profound and potentially tyrannical institutional control to override human choice.
So this deep dive shows us that ignoring the facts of human variation for the sake of an ideological project,
it risks the very competence required to maintain a complex, functioning society.